You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. Join us as we delve into the dark corners of history, exploring tales of murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history. We are two women who, despite being friends for over 6 years now, have never met face to face.
That's right. And yet our passion for all things eerie and unexplained keeps us closer than ever. We can never meet, can we?
It's a done thing now.
Before we start today, we'd love to give a huge shout out to our Patreon members and to all of our listeners who support us and keep the podcast going. Thank you very much. Thank you. Because since we got Bean, the destroyer, I have to put 2 dogs into daycare on the days we record, and she's expensive. We really couldn't be more grateful. And if you want to know more about the different ways to get in touch with us and support us, please listen to the end of the podcast, because that is when we will tell you all about that. Right now, it's time to get into today's story, and it is a big one.
It is. It's something like so many times. I have the feeling I say that so many times already. It has been on my mind for years. Like, I watched documentaries, I read books, and you remember I wanted to do an episode about it ever since we started this podcast, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
About Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre. And the reason why I pushed it further back and back and back was that it's like every other high-profile case that we don't want to get it wrong. Like, for example, with the Beaumont children or the Clutters or John List. It's scary because it's a given that there are so many people out there who know the cases inside out. And there might be things that we could get wrong and would get wrong and will get wrong. But we figured, as always, we just can do our best and try to do the victims justice. There is a couple of things when it comes to the Jonestown Massacre that peeve me a little bit, and I need to air my grievances of how this is sometimes talked about. Especially this kind of pop culture joke it turned in, which I really don't appreciate and don't like. But that's not for today. Because today we will be talking about Jim Jones and basically his origin story. I think we can all agree that this is a case that needs its time and we don't want to rush it. I think a whole podcast could be, and probably was, filled with everything that has to do with Jonestown. So you might have already guessed it. This will be a 3-part episode, 4-part episode, we will see. This week, as I said, it's the Jim Jones origin story. Next week we will discuss the People's Temple, how it all started, and then how he became the cult leader. And in the final installment, we will tell you about the horrible events that took place on 18th of November 1978 in the Jonestown settlement in the jungle of Guyana, or I think in English you say Guyana, right? And also the aftermath. And I hope that all makes sense.
Yeah, you know more about this topic than I do, and I am very much looking forward to getting into it.
Also, watch me, or better hear me, referring to it as Jamestown.
Yeah.
At least once in this episode, because that constantly happens to me. As for sources, oh boy, there are so many. Of course, we will link all the articles and videos and books in the according albums. But I'd say for this first episode, the biggest source was the book The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and People's Temple by Jeff Ginn. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to start at the beginning. 13th of May, 1931, because that is the day when James Warren Jones was born in the small town of Crete, Indiana, to his parents Lynetta Putnam and James Thurman Jones. He was their only child.
I just want to interrupt you here because I think you already know it as well and said it as well. This story has so many things that will remind us of our
last week
4 episodes.
It's wild.
I mean, the name of the town was Crete.
Yep.
First of all.
Yeah. There's a lot. And so this aspect of Jim Jones's life often meant that he was the center of attention, especially with his mother, Lynetta, who had a strong influence on his upbringing and beliefs. I think understanding Jones's childhood provides critical insight into the development of his character and the facets that contributed to the tragic events he later instigated. So, what do we know about Lynetta? Not that much, to be honest. Apparently, it's not even 100% clear where she was born or when. It might have been 1902, 1904. Who can say? And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. If she was born in Princeton, Indiana, or Mount Carmel, I'm going to pronounce all these things wrong. If she was born in Indiana or Ohio, it doesn't matter. She was a defiant young girl who loved nature and was interested in animals, and extremely interested in spiritualism and reincarnation. She sounds like every young girl ever in the history of, don't we all go through that phase when we're into reincarnation and crystals and animals, and you're in your horse phase and you're in your crystal era? In 1920, so she's either 16 or 18, she marries for the first time, but it wasn't built to last. They got divorced after 2 years, and then in 1923, Lynetta married a second time, and this time the divorce came even quicker, after only 3 days. Lynetta thought 3 times the charm, and so she marries one more time, and this time it's to a man named James Thurman Jones.
I think it's very understandable that she remarried. Back in those days, life for a single woman was tough. It was tough.
Absolutely. It's very hard. James was the son of a prominent landowner in Indiana, and he fathered a total of 13 children with 2 women. Out of these 13 children, all but 2 became very successful and valuable members of society. Not only the sons that were sent off to college, also the daughters. And don't forget, we're talking turn of the century here. James, also called Jim, was not that lucky. He enlisted in the U.S. Army during World War I and was sent to fight in France, where he was caught in one of the absolutely horrific gas attacks.
I know we talked about World War I here and there, especially we talked about trench foot when we did the episodes about Yossi Ginsberg and his friends in the Bolivian jungle. But I don't think we ever really talked about the gas attacks during World War I, right?
I don't think so, no.
World War I, of course, back before World War II, referred to as the Great War, stands out as one of the most horrendous conflicts in human history due to its unprecedented scale, brutality, and also the introduction of new forms of warfare that caused widespread devastation and suffering. Don't get me wrong, war and battles have obviously always been horrible and traumatizing. I don't think there is any argument against it, but you have to imagine how World War I and the technology and tactics used changed warfare to make it even more horrible. Basically, up until then, most battles were more like, okay, let's meet at this battleground and fight it out. Or, no, have our plebs fight it out for us.
Right.
And, of course, Napoleon had already changed a lot of known tactics with his sneakiness.
Can't underestimate the sneakiness.
But World War I was a whole different thing. We have the trenches, muddy, waterlogged trenches for months on end, deplorable living conditions. These trenches were breeding grounds for disease with rampant lice infestations, the aforementioned trench foot, and dysentery causing significant suffering. We also already talked about the dysentery in the Garfield episode.
We did.
And then the constant threat of enemy attacks and the relentless bombardment of artillery shells that created an environment of perpetual fear and stress, leading to severe psychological trauma known as shell shock. And now it's recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Then there was the introduction of chemical warfare that added another layer of horror to the conflict. So as I said, poison gases such as chlorine and mustard gas, for example, that inflicted agonizing injuries and deaths, often lingering in the lungs and causing prolonged suffering. The indiscriminate nature of chemical attacks coupled with the terrifying effects spread panic among the soldiers and civilians alike, as these weapons were difficult to defend against and could incapacitate or kill with terrifying efficiency. The war's massive casualties were another stark indicator of its brutality. Battles such as the one at Somme or Verdun or Passchendaele resulted in staggering numbers of death and injuries. Advances in military technology, including machine guns and artillery, combined with outdated tactics, led to devastatingly high death tolls. The scale of carnage was unlike anything previously seen, with entire generations of young men decimated. The casualties are truly inconceivable. The total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was approximately 40 million, with estimates ranging from 15 to 20 million deaths and around 23 million wounded military personnel. This places World War I among the deadliest conflicts in human history. It might sound extremely exaggerated, but the death toll includes 9 to 11 million military personnel and about 6 to 13 million civilians. The Triple Entente, which were the Allies, lost roughly 6 million military personnel, while the Central Powers lost around 4 million. And additionally, at least 2 million people died from diseases, and 6 million went missing and were presumed dead. These figures are based on official published sources, and about 2/3 of the military deaths in World War I occurred in battle, which was kind of newish because in 19th century conflicts, the majority of deaths were due to disease. And speaking of disease, we can't forget the flu pandemic, also people who died while prisoner of war, and that makes up for about 1/3 of total military deaths at the time. And we could go on and on, how now there were tanks and flamethrowers and machine guns. Like, can you even imagine the new horrors of war they had to face, these young boys?
Awful.
But we are here to talk about Jim Jones, which is another level of awful.
Yeah. Humans are the worst. Like, come on. We had to come up with chemical weapons. Why?
The war horses in World War I.
I can't even. I can't. Yeah. So, back to something also horrible, but that doesn't want to make us cry. Jim Jones Sr. At the age of around 30, he volunteers to fight in World War I, and he's sent to France where he experiences the horrors of a gas attack. But he was one of the lucky ones, and he survived. But of course, his life would never be the same. He returned home, but his lungs and respiratory system and voice were all badly damaged. And for the rest of his life, he had difficulties breathing, and of course, he suffered from PTSD. Up until now, Jim was a bachelor, and his family had probably thought he would stay unmarried forever. But in 1926, he met Lynetta, who was almost 20 years younger than him, and the couple married in December of that year.
And Lynetta probably thought she finally managed to marry into a well-respected and well-off family that would provide her with some financial security. But that's not what happened. Her father-in-law bought them a farm in Crete, Indiana, as Annie said before, which is very generous. But that was pretty much all the support at that point. I don't think that was out of meanness. I think it was more like listen, I raised 13 children and most of them are doing fine. Here's some land.
Yeah.
But you need to see what you make of it by yourself approach, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And it's hard to complain. I mean, they were given a homestead, so what else do you want?
Well, life on the farm wasn't easy, though, for the newlyweds, because they needed money to buy seeds and equipment, for example. So Jim Sr., who wasn't senior back then, but you know what I mean, he worked away from the farm to make money that they could invest in the things they needed, which meant that Lynetta was left alone at home, taking care of the household, the livestock, and the fields. And that's a lot, especially for a young woman who didn't come from a farming background.
Oh, it sounds like a nightmare.
Horrible. And he was gone for days at a time because his job, like, I think he was working for road construction or something like that, took him away for prolonged times. And I think Lynetta hated her life. And worse, every week or so, they would drive over to the next town to Lynn to visit Jim Sr.'s family in their nice houses with their white-collar jobs. And if life was bad now, it would not get better because Jim Sr.'s health was only getting worse every year, and soon he was pretty much incapable of doing most physical labor. He did have a small veteran pension, but there was just no way to live from that. And if it was hard to feed 2 eaters with what they had, how about adding another person to that household? Because Lynetta became pregnant, and their son James Warren Jones was born, as Annie said, on 13th of May 1931. After the boy's birth, Jim Sr. further deteriorated, not only his physical health, but of course also his mental health. and he was pretty much in and out of the hospital at that point. In his patient file, Jim Sr. was described as, quote, nervous, emotional, irritable, nervous system and general physical condition below par, end quote.
Yeah, same.
Lynetta was not impressed and pretty much resented her husband for being weak and incapable of supporting her. And ultimately, they lost the farm, and the Jones family once more stepped in and managed to get Jim Sr. and his wife and child a place to rent in Lynn, where the rest of the family lived. And Lynn was a step up from Crete that was just a couple of farms and a corn silo, but it too was just a tiny town of roughly 100 inhabitants, and everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew everything. And that's not great for a person like Lynetta, who was rather defiant. She wore pants, she smoked, she cursed in public, and pretty much didn't act as it was expected from women back in the day. Lynn was one of those towns that had a big sense of community, lots of clubs and gatherings, and Jim Sr. would start to hang out in one of those clubs. And unfortunately, it wasn't a book club or the American Birding Association or the Elks Lodge. No, he joined a group that was on the up and up in Indiana at the time, or had been on the up and up, was already a little bit on its way out, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. As the Klan is one of the most infamous hate groups, I'm sure most of our listeners have at least heard about it.
Do you know what's funny? You were just talking about all the parallels, and I almost got into a whole discussion about the KKK and James Garfield's opposition to them back when they were first getting popular and forming after the Civil War, and here we go. I ended up cutting it because I didn't have time.
Yeah, so crazy, all the parallels.
So wild.
So it was founded in December of 1865 in Tennessee by 6 Confederate veterans, and initially it was a social club, but it quickly transformed into a violent organization aiming to restore white supremacy in the post-Civil War South. The Klan used terror tactics, including lynchings, beatings, and intimidation to suppress newly freed African Americans and to oppose Reconstruction efforts. By the early 1870s, federal intervention, including the Enforcement Acts, weakened the Klan, leading to its temporary decline. But not for long, because it experienced a resurgence in 1915, basically sparked by the release of the pro-Klan film The Birth of a Nation and a wave of nativist sentiment. The second Klan expanded its targets to include not only African Americans, but pretty much all other immigrants, like other groups deemed un-American. At its peak in the 1920s, the Klan claimed millions of members and wielded significant political influence, particularly in the Midwest and South. It portrayed itself as a defender of traditional American values and morality, often aligning with prohibition and anti-immigration sentiments. However, there were scandals and internal divisions, and public backlash led to its decline by the late 1930s. So all this time is referred to as the second Klan. And there's also a third Klan, but we're not going to get into that. And that's also when it became more popular in Indiana. And although Indiana had a smaller African American population compared to the southern states, racial prejudice and fears of racial integration were still significant issues. And the Klan also positioned itself as a moral watchdog, advocating for prohibition and the traditional family values.
You know, like murder and terror. Traditional family values.
Well, they also had family picnics.
That's right. Did I ever tell you my parents went to one of those picnics back in the day?
What?
Did I never tell you this story?
No.
When my dad was stationed in North Carolina, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in the Army, they were invited to a picnic. And they went. This is in the late 60s. And it wasn't long before they realized that they were actually at a Klan gathering.
Jesus.
Yeah. So Mom pretended to have a migraine so they could leave. They got out. They were like, how do we get out of this without angering anybody? It was wild.
You think you're invited to a nice family picnic and...
Yeah, totally. That wasn't that long ago. People think this is all like ancient history, and it is not.
Back to the KKK in Indiana. So under the leadership of D.C. Stevenson, the Indiana Klan grew rapidly, boasting that they had a membership of between 250,000 and 300,000 at its peak. That's a lot of people.
That is too many white hoods.
Yeah. Stevenson's organizational skills and charisma helped the Klan gain significant political power, with members holding, and that's the problem, influential positions in local and state government. Many politicians sought the Klan's endorsement to win elections, which further legitimized the organization and extended its influence. Thankfully, the Klan's dominance in Indiana was rather short-lived, of the second Klan. A series of scandals and, as I said, internal conflicts quickly eroded its power. So by the time Jim Sr. and his family arrived in Lynn, the Klan was already on its way out. But Jim Sr. still thought, well, that's some nice traditional fellas, old-fashioned organization, organizing family picnics. I should make friends with them. The thing is, I don't even think he was heavily involved with them. I don't think it was a big part of his life, because he was very sick already, and what I'm trying to say is I think that Jim Jones later made that story bigger to profit off of it.
Right.
Because the way he portrayed his father was not in the best light. You know what I mean?
Right. I do.
But we're gonna circle back to that anyway. Yeah. Like, I don't think he was like...
He wasn't looking to find a place to channel all his hatred. That's how it happens with most people. I don't think most people actually go out there trying to find people to be terrible to. They're looking for acceptance, they're looking for understanding, and they find it from really, really terrible people.
And that's also a big topic that we're going to have with the whole People's Temple here. Not that the people of the People's Temple were horrible. They were, quite on the contrary, they were lovely people, most of them. But, trying to find a place of acceptance, That's a big theme here, overall theme.
Absolutely. It's Cults 101, isn't it? It's how they get you. So everyone is welcoming to Jim Sr., and of course he's a member of the family, and also he's a wounded veteran, and so he gets a job at a railroad office. They get a hand-me-down car, and life is not too bad. But Lynetta is still not happy. She wanted more, she thought that she was better than this, and she did not want to play by the town's rules. I should also mention that they never attended church because Lynetta was not a fan of organized religion. I hate to say it because apart from the grabbiness, I really identified hard with Lynetta. It's like she drinks, she smokes, she swears, she does not want to go to your church service.
I mean, she doesn't sound too bad in the beginning, I agree.
Except she's also just miserable and unhappy.
Yeah, very much so.
If you could be those things and also be a happy little joy in the world, then now we're talking.
People could probably have lived with her swearing, smoking, and wearing pants, but committing the crime of not attending church on Sunday, how very dare they?
Straight to hell. Pick out your handbasket, you're going. So, the family life exposed Jim Jr., or Jimmy, as he was called, to a blend of instability and nonconformity, fostering an environment where he developed a complex relationship with authority and societal norms. He often felt like an outsider, because he was. His peers often regarded him as odd and a rather intense child, further alienating him from typical social interactions. The isolation drove him to seek validation and identity through other means, particularly through his burgeoning interest in religion and social justice. His mother's unconventional beliefs and encouragement of his nonconformity reinforced his sense of being different, yet special. Jimmy could also be seen running around the streets of Lynn by himself, or he would hang out at the local airport watching the crop dusters take off. The reason Jimmy was running around town after school was that Lynetta had a rule. Her son was not allowed to be home alone when she was at work. I mean, we were all latchkey kids in the 80s and 90s, but at least we were allowed to be in the house.
Right?
Right?
And I even read somewhere that he was running around naked sometimes, which... like really naked, or just like without a shirt or in his underwear, because I can't imagine that he was running around naked.
No. There would have been more of a kerfuffle if he'd been running around naked. It's just so odd that he wasn't allowed to be home alone, but he could be unsupervised around strangers, like all over town.
I mean, I think this was because his dad's family, almost all of the uncles and aunts lived there, and like there were always people watching out. I guess you know how it was.
Yeah, it's just interesting that she didn't have somebody keep an eye on him.
It's just... because I read of an incident where because he had really cool toys apparently, like for example, like a movie projector or something like that. And he snuck back home when his mom wasn't home and showed his friends, and she came home and started beating him up because he dared to go home without his parents being home because they were at work. I don't want to feel sorry for him. I just like his upbringing was...
Well, it's the same with Guiteau. We can feel sorry for the child that went through all of these things.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. And also, it was not like he was a stray cat and everyone just shooed him away. Like, he had lots of relatives, as I said, in town, and they did look after him. And I think back in the day, it already showed how... I don't know if charismatic is the right word for a kid. You know what I mean?
I do. Like precocious and engaging and
Engaging, that's a good word, because he kind of could connect with all different kinds of people. He was apparently a likable kid in a way, if he wanted to be, at least from an adult point of view. I think many just felt sorry for him because his parents were kind of weird, and Jimmy often claimed that he was scared of his dad, which I can't even understand. If his dad is suffering from PTSD and you're a kid and you don't really know what's going on and why he's acting the way he's acting, maybe.
Oh, of course. And also, people didn't talk about mental health back then. It was this sort of, even if you were seriously going through it, there would never be a discussion like, you know, your dad experienced some pretty tough stuff and this is how we deal. You know, there's none of that. It's just, you're on your own.
And we're going to talk about that later, but people just assumed he was an alcoholic.
Right, of course. Yeah.
So Jimmy would hang out at other people's houses and he would, for example, compliment them on their beautiful homes and how good their food tastes. He was a very polite kid and he always found something to chat about. Like, for example, if you liked gardening, that's what he would chat about with you. Or if you had a dog, he would talk about that. If you were a God-fearing, church-going person, he would ask you questions and would listen to you reading the scripture, soaking up every word like an eager little sponge. But then when it came to connecting with his peers, he really struggled at times. First of all, because he was a bit of a crier. Back in those days, it was more of a boys don't cry kind of time. The other thing he did, he would give the local kids sex ed on his porch, like he was lecturing them about sexual intercourse in very much of detail.
Oh, nice.
Obviously, that's a hobby that didn't make the grown-ups too happy.
There's always that one kid, though, right? There's always one kid that knows all the stuff and is going to tell everybody all the stuff.
I think it came, if I remember correctly, because he spent the summer in a more rural area, and there were all the farm animals. I think that's what it was.
Oh, no.
And sometimes he was downright creepy, and I mean creepy in the point of view of 1940s rural Indiana, because the next story is rather well known, and most of our Hellions will not find that creepy at all. Because one time he led a group of boys into the shop of a casket maker. Lynn was apparently a place where no one ever locked their doors, not even the businesses. And he told the boys, each and every single one of them, to get into one of the caskets, one right after the other, and lie completely still and close their eyes so that they could experience what it would feel like to be dead.
I kind of like this kid.
In kind of a parallel universe where he didn't turn out to be a complete sociopath murdering hundreds of people, the kid, Jim Jones, could have been almost one of us, because I'm sure many Hellions can relate to that story in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a shame that he turns out to be such a terrible, terrible person.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, this is what I always find interesting, though. It's like they don't start out that way. And that's what we're going to be discussing, isn't it, in part? It's like, how does this happen? It's why we're here.
How does it happen, yeah?
How? So, on the other hand, there's another well-known fact about his childhood. When he was 10 years old, the U.S. joins World War II, and everyone and their grandma, of course, is super patriotic and supporting the troops. But not so much Jimmy Jones. He was apparently fascinated by the Nazis and the charisma of their leader, Adolf Hitler, and he studied his antics and techniques intensely. I don't think this was about any ideology, but more about how fascinated he was by how Hitler seduced and controlled the masses. And so Jones would find a couple of boys way younger than himself that he could convince to play Nazi troops with him, and he brought them to a field and started to make them march around in goose step. So they're just goose stepping across the field, which is funny.
Wait a minute.
What?
Is it really Are we talking about marching, like what soldiers do? Is it really called goose step in English?
Yes. Goose, like the Rockettes, kind of, but like goose stepping. I even had a teacher who demonstrated it.
But goose step sounds super cute. How is anyone taking your soldiers seriously if they're goose stepping around?
How do you call it in German?
Stechschritt.
What does that mean?
Roughly stepping step.
Oh, okay. So more of a fear or precision move and less of a way to admire their shapely legs.
Absolutely.
Is it
stepping step.
With the stabby step. I love the stabby step. It's also kind of interesting because this whole thing with Jim Jones and studying Hitler, we, in one of my psych classes, studied Hitler for this very reason. And it's interesting because it almost makes you look again and wonder, all the people that thought he was a charming, sweet little kid, was he just practicing?
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep. That's how I see it. I think he was practicing how to approach people and how to make them like you. And that sounds a lot like a sociopath, right?
It does.
Faking this kind of connection to humans.
Well, and also making that sort of connection with Hitler.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, so Jim Jones was an admirer of Hitler.
Yeah.
Doesn't even come that big of a surprise. I'd say, thank God, Jim Jones didn't go into politics. Well, he kind of did, but not really. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He became a preacher instead.
Oh, good.
Because despite his mother's aversion to organized religion, Jim Jones exhibited a keen interest in church activities from a very young age. And I'd say this interest was not purely spiritual. Let me rephrase that. It was most likely not spiritual at all. But who can say? Rather, I think it was more of a fascination with the power and control that religious leaders wielded over their congregations. Growing up, Jones frequently attended church services of various denominations, absorbing the different styles of preaching and the ways in which religious leaders could captivate and manipulate their audiences. And as a child, Jim Jones was already known to conduct mock church services for his friends and mock funeral services and things like that. And he definitely demonstrated an early proclivity for leadership and a huge desire to influence others. He preached fervently, mimicking the fire and brimstone style of the preachers he admired, and even performed, as I said, funerals for small animals. And these early practices were most definitely more than just childhood play. I think they were a manifestation of his ever-growing ambition to lead and control. He would often wander out into the woods all by himself, standing on a tree stump, and practice preaching just as if he was standing in front of a whole congregation at a very young age already.
This is really interesting to me because I have quite a few friends who, you know, these days there are more and more people who have no religious affiliation and who have never been to a religious service at all. And I have a few friends who have attended Catholic Mass with me before, who have remarked that it feels very uncomfortable and it feels like a cult. And that it's very strange to be sitting there and listening to an entire giant church cathedral full of people, like all reciting exactly the same thing at the same time. And I was explaining how, yeah, like as when I was a believer, it really brought a lot of comfort. It's that sense of like knowing what's coming next and running through your prayers.
It's a ritual, yeah.
It's a ritual and it's a comfort.
Yeah.
But ever since I heard that, whenever I'm now at like a wedding or just any kind of religious event, I'm like, oh, I see your point. Like if you've never gone to anything and you're watching someone stand up there, literally controlling what this entire like 1,000 people are going to say, that's powerful.
It is.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying churches are cults. I'm just saying that I can see the draw to somebody wanting to control people. I can understand why they would study Hitler, and I can understand why they would be into preaching.
No, I know exactly what you mean. Exactly that.
Yeah. So in school, Jones is an avid reader, and he's an excellent student. But as we said before, his intense personality and peculiar behaviors make it difficult for him to form lasting friendships. He also really liked to talk a lot about religion and sex, so...
That would never change.
No.
I mean, he turned away from religion a little bit and became more political and socialist.
Yeah. Also around that time, rumors started to spread that Jim Sr. was a closet alcoholic because he could so often be seen stumbling down the streets of Lind, which is a good, dry, God-fearing town. And it's really sad because Jim Jones Sr. was not drunk. He was suffering not only from his body failing him, but from PTSD and other mental health issues. And his family knew, but no one ever cleared up these rumors because they preferred the whole town thought he was a drunk than to think that he had mental health problems, which is awful.
Because there was so much stigma. There is still a lot of stigma, but more so in the 40s and 50s. I mean,
definitely. I think his outsider position made Jim Jones Jr. gravitate more toward individuals on the margins of society. He often championed the cause of the underdog and the oppressed. And there's some foreshadowing here. The inclination toward social justice would later become a hallmark of his ministry and the thing that pulled people in. Because obviously nobody would have joined this cult if he hadn't been so charismatic. And not only charismatic, but also he offered them kindness and help and a society full of people like them. No one would have joined if he would have worn his increasingly authoritarian and paranoid tendencies on his sleeve, right?
That's exactly the point, and that's one of the grievances I have. People, when they talk about it or make jokes about it, it's like, well, why did they join a cult? They didn't join a cult. They followed a preacher, a Christian preacher, who showed them kindness and gave them a community and made them believe in this kind of community.
That's right. And that's why cults are so problematic. I mean, it's a huge problem everywhere still to this day.
Yeah.
But nobody goes into it thinking, I'm going to join a cult. You are taken in by a shyster who is trying to control you. And before you know it, you're in a cult. You don't start out thinking you're in a cult. Nobody starts out saying, hey, I'm going to join this cult.
Nobody says, hey, will you want to join our cult?
Yeah. It's not how it works.
And it can possibly happen to everyone.
Of course it can.
Like I listened to a couple of podcasts lately about cults here in Europe. And it was always people were like, well, I always thought that could never happen to me. But then it did.
Of course. Yep. Absolutely. So, this sense of social justice is also strengthened during his teenage years. That's when he starts to read Marxist and socialist literature. The concept of an egalitarian society really resonated with his sense of social justice and his disdain for the racial and economic inequalities he observed around him. These early ideological influences planted the seeds for his future emphasis on communal living and racial integration within the People's Temple.
Which is another parallel to our episodes about Garfield, which is how did you call it, Bible communism?
Yes.
It's also a big topic here.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was a socialist, but he also wanted to stand out. And one thing he did was that he would wear his best Sunday clothes every day. All the time. Every day he would be either in a suit or in nice slacks. And that was very not the norm in Lynn at the time. And also he acted a bit aloof. He was leaning around the school's hallways and he never, if somebody came to him and addressed him, he never replied. He only talked when he talked first, which is...
Oh, that's fun.
I wonder why he had no friends.
I can't imagine. He was like, listen, no one is ever going to like me. I'm going to need to go ahead and plan for a cult leadership here. It's the only way.
Of course, Jim Jones also made some experiences with the, in Lynn at the time, rather new Pentecostal church. This definitely also formed Jim Jones and played a crucial role in shaping his future ministry. Now, if I get anything wrong about the Pentecostal church, please forgive me. But from my understanding, the center of the Pentecostal belief is the experience of the baptism in the Holy Spirit, which believers see as a distinct and empowering experience following conversion. And this baptism is often evidenced by speaking in tongues, which the term for it is glossolalia. Is that true?
Yep.
This is considered a sign of the Holy Spirit's presence, and other spiritual gifts such as prophecy, healing, and interpretation of tongues are also highly valued and practiced within Pentecostal communities. The thing with the Pentecostal worship, it's very lively and expressive. Like, it's not boring.
It's not boring.
It's not boring
It's
at all.
not.
It's featuring enthusiastic singing, clapping, dancing, spontaneous prayers, healing. Like people are like, I can walk now, and then do flip-flops around the aisles.
Mm-hmm.
Also often include personal testimonies, as I said, faith healing sessions, and altar calls for salvation and spiritual renewal. The emphasis on direct personal experience of God fosters a sense of immediacy and intimacy in worship. I think that's what attracts a lot of people. And also the emotional intensity of Pentecostal worship with its emphasis on faith healing and miracles. And that captivated Jim Jones. Like, he was really trying to get into these faith healing things. He was not super successful, but he very much incorporated that in his sermon. And he very early on recognized the power these elements had to draw people in and hold their devotion. And these formative religious experiences provided him with a blueprint for his own ministry, where he would later employ very similar tactics to attract and to control his followers. It was also in high school when he showed signs of cruelty against animals, and I'm not going into details because no. But Jimmy had always appeared to love animals, but I think that was also just like a ruse. Again, it's probably this thing of sociopath where they act nice and kind and adapt behavior that they see in others, and people like others who are kind to animals, okay, then I'll be kind to animals, while it was all fake in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the picture painted of him is increasingly disturbing and creepy.
Yeah. And he's still so young.
This is it. He's so young.
So when Jimmy was about to graduate high school, Lynetta, who did have an affair for years already, and who very obviously hated her husband, she left Jim Sr. and Lynn for good and moved to the next bigger city. And Jimmy left with his mother and enrolled in a high school in Richmond. He hated his father as well and claimed all over town that his dad had been violent towards him and his mom. And apparently most people didn't believe that, and I don't know if it's true. It's absolutely possible, absolutely, but it could very well have been yet another story to receive sympathy from people. And that's what I meant before with the KKK story.
Mm-hmm.
It could very well be that he just exaggerated that whole story and blew it up because, as we will learn, the more we continue with the story, he very much used the whole civil rights movement for his advantage. For his
own gain. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the main reason he absolutely hated his dad is because he grew up watching his mother hating his dad, though.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you grow up like that and you always just, you know what I mean.
I do.
Jim Sr., he was actually really sad that his wife and son just left him and his health deteriorated rapidly. He passed away in 1951 at the age of 63 or 64, and people said he looked 90. His tombstone apparently is engraved with the words, quote, "Everyone in the world is my friend," end quote.
That's really so sad.
I mean, look, I can understand in a way back in those days where mental health issues were such a taboo, and you have a husband that has not only mental health problems, but also physical restraints, and he can't provide. And that's pretty much the reason why she married him.
Right.
That she started to resent him, but that doesn't make it right.
No. So now in Richmond, 17-year-old Jim Jones was required to find a job after school because his father's family is no longer going to help them at all because they've run off and abandoned him. And also his father's small veteran pension was no longer available to them. So he started to work as a night orderly at Reed Memorial Hospital. There, he was well liked by the patients, he remembered all of their names and their interests, and he was always friendly and in a good mood.
Can I just say, no matter how much I despise this person, I have to say that studying during the day, preparing for graduation, and also working a full-time job at night is extremely hard.
Yeah.
Heads off for that, at least.
Absolutely. And Jimmy graduated high school in 1948, and for a while he didn't know if he still wanted to be a preacher. He thought maybe he should pursue a medical career.
Spoiler alert, he did in fact not become a doctor. Also not a doctor.
Not a doctor.
But all joking aside, I think this is probably the perfect moment to stop for this week. Now we know quite a bit about Jim Jones' background and his upbringing. And as I said, I think it's very important to understand everything so that we can understand, or not even understand, but can try to, how do I say that? We can't really understand what happened, but
we're just trying to understand the pieces and how they all came together to create this situation and this person. I just find him so creepy because the more you think about it, the more I just think that this guy maybe was just one of these awful, born a sociopath and controlling the whole time. We're going to get into it.
We'll talk so much more, but his surviving son, Stephen, I saw an interview and he said his father was evil and knew he was evil, but he didn't want anybody else to know that.
I believe that. All right.
Do you have something good?
So much more to discuss. Do I have something good? Yes. I don't know if I've talked about these things yet or not, but you know who I'm absolutely loving at the moment is Nicola Coughlan. She is the blonde that was in Derry Girls. If you've never seen the television show Derry Girls, I highly, highly, highly recommend everybody watch it. It's about a group of girls growing up in Northern Ireland in the 90s during the Troubles. They're like our age. And so it's this like coming of age story in Northern Ireland. And it's so funny and it's so brilliantly done. And she's wonderful in that. And she's also in Bridgerton, which anything Regency, I'm here for it. And I love the costumes. I'm just enjoying it. I'm very much enjoying season 3 of Bridgerton and the whole Colin and Penelope storyline. And I just adore Nicola Coughlan, and I'm loving seeing her everywhere in the news lately. It just makes me happy.
My something good is also a show I watched recently. I don't know if anyone is interested in Korean TV shows. On Netflix, there's The 8 Show, and people think it's similar to the Squid Game, but the premise is kind of similar. It's also about a TV show that people are brought into. But the thing is a critique of our society and about the way money is distributed to our society. And it's really, really interesting to watch. I didn't really much like the last episode, but up until then it was really good and it painted a very good picture of how everything with money works here and how the people who have money hold all the power, and there is just not a chance in the world for most people who are way down in the pyramid to ever get up there.
That's right.
And that it's basically also just by chance and by luck where you are born into.
Oh, absolutely.
Really interesting. So I can really recommend that TV show. That's my something.
Definitely. Cool.
All right.
That's all for this week. If you liked this episode or any of our episodes, we would be so incredibly grateful if you would leave us a rating or a review. It really helps. It really helps in so many ways. We just can't tell you. You can email us at freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Our website is freshhellpodcast.com, and there you will find links to our merch store, our Patreon, all the different places that you can listen to us, our P.O. box, anything else you might need. What else?
Yes, that's pretty much it. Please tell your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, kiss them, take them to the vet, and always, always, from the bottom of your heart, be kind to them. Don't fake it.
No.
Be kind to your fellow human beings. Also, don't fake that. If you're not in the mood to be kind, just walk away. It's also fine.
Yeah.
And the most important and hardest part of it all, be kind to yourself.
And if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
See you next week.